and welcome back to Procedural Systems for Production in Cinema 4D. In this lesson, we'll be building upon some of the techniques and approaches that we learned from the last lesson and start our design phase, begin developing the design language and the various systems that we can use for our foam, our cushions, and our stitching. We'll start some look development and explore various style frames that can help respond to the brief. And we'll be building upon that design language to start concepting for our first shot. Once we dive into that first shot, some of the techniques we can cover is creating different subsystems and a procedural set of relationships that we can utilize throughout. And we'll begin kind of creating different layered elements by manipulating instances of our base system. So really excited to start diving into the look development and design language phase and begin building out from there. Before we start diving into cinema, let's take a look at our brief again and see what we're building towards and make sure we kind of refocus ourselves in terms of responding to some of the various points throughout the brief that we need to touch on. So let's take a look at that quickly. So jumping back into our brief, we can take a look at some of the benefits and some of the concepts that the client would like us to convey. I think we did a good job in gathering ref that can help us throughout the process and get a sense of how we can tackle some of these various product points and benefits that we need to cover. And I think it's a good thing to stay focused throughout the exploration process, but not to be exclusionary in what we come up with and really keeping an open mind throughout, especially early on. And as we kind of move throughout the process, we can begin to funnel that down and refine towards a specific shot or a specific concept that we're looking to convey. So let's take a look quickly at our reference once again, just to refocus ourselves and get a sense of the different aspects that we need to keep in mind. So for the feeling, again, just to briefly retouch on some of these, I think there's a lot of aspects of this that feels great. The really getting a sense of how exceptional the support and the cushioning is, and really getting kind of enveloped by this delicate and spring-back foam is something to keep in mind. Specifically for the cushioning, which we'll be diving into now, there's a lot about the reference board that we have here that's working, some of the things that is not, and we can begin to kind of get our own voice and really make this ownable for ourselves as we move forward. But this is a good starting point and a good thing to keep in the back of our heads to kind of stay as our North Star as we move forward. Some of these patterns, again, are working super nice, and we can utilize this as well. I think there's a nice blend here between kind of organic and manufactured, and we can try to invoke as much of this as possible with our style frames and as we begin concepting our shot. Again, the layering, this will kind of come more into play once we work on a specific shot. The base kind of design system we'll utilize this a little bit, but it's more once we have that design language laid out, we can begin utilizing this layering to really build up from there in terms of different forms, different materials, etc. And I think a good overarching point to always keep in the back of our heads is kind of this very high-end, sophisticated look, but also referring back to the brief that the client wants it to be approachable to all and feel very welcoming, but also feel, a little bit more high-end, more luxury, and have a lot of this kind of minimalist, refined look to the product. So some of the initial sketches that I did, good to revisit now at this point, now that we've kind of touched on some early explorations of approach and some techniques that we can use. A lot of these style frames can help inform us as we move forward. It's really ultimately for me just kind of to wet my palate and get a sense of what I feel is working, what I feel isn't, and just kind of get the ball rolling in that regard. But it's good to take a look back at these to kind of see what your early ideas were, and if there's anything that you're kind of missing along the way that'd be nice to circle back on. So in the interest of time, I won't be running through specifically this lighting setup or the materials, but we will be providing the scene file in case anyone wants to look through it. It's fairly straightforward, primarily, in terms of lighting and the materials. Just trying to stay focused on invoking the feeling that we're going for and responding to the brief in a variety of different ways. So for the lighting specifically, just trying to make it feel kind of a bit elevated while also being warm and inviting. So I also have a material here. It's a combination between GSG's bed sheet gray material and some foam material as well to get some of these nice specular hits throughout. And we have some subsurface scattering going on, so I have a backlighting going on here just so we get some nice color shifts on the edges, which will be a little bit more apparent in some of the other setups. And we're using HDRI. Again, the lighting's pretty straightforward. I think I'm using, Creative Office here. And we have a couple different lights that are taking advantage of area light maps from GSG as well. And then for some nice atmospherics here, we're using some dust from GSG. So again, pretty straightforward setup. Primarily, we're going to talk through kind of doing exploratory, introductory base forms that we can utilize down the line. So let's start taking a look at that now. So diving into the first system that we have here, it's using a lot of the techniques that we learned in the last lesson. So we can just quickly go through this. I have a base plane here, and this is kind of our initial form, and I'm extruding that to get this shape. But one important thing to note here, if I get rid of this octane tag that I have here, you can see we're keeping this really low poly, which will help with pushing as much as we can to the render side and keeping this really lightweight in terms of our rig, especially as we move into our shot. We want to, make this as lightweight as possible and easy to be instanced and iterated upon. So how we're doing that here is rather than, on this side, if I was to grab, a subdivision surface and throw this system in there, we can get the same look, but we're actually, generating this on within our scene and increasing the poly count. We can circumnavigate that by instead throwing on our render tag of choice here and doing the subdivisions on render side. So again, keeps it really lightweight. There are obviously some drawbacks here, being if we need to affect this with collisions, you're not going to actually be able to hit as close as possible. And those are kind of some of the pros and cons that you have to face when you're moving forward with this stuff. But with our design phase here, it makes a lot of sense to keep it as lightweight as possible. So as I was kind of moving through this to try to develop our language, this was the kind of introductory block that I began developing. So have the Mo extrude here. I'm using a PolyFX to be able to break up some of these polygons to remove some, and then using simply a plane effector, reducing the position and the scale. Let me reapproach this a little bit so you can have more room. And deleting basically some of these polygons. The spherical field is what is affecting that here. And you can see we can change the shape, get some nice different shapes. I should actually drag this into here just to make it a little bit more clear. But you can see we can begin to define our shape here in a nice way and play around with how we'd like this to look like that. That's starting to look cool as well. Within the MoExtrude, I have this plane effector, which is pushing the position upwards, which gives us the variation of height within those cushions. So you see it's flat here, and then the spherical field is allowing us to drive that height however we'd like. So this gives us a nice control, and we can start to build out some kind of base cushions and get a good sense of the look that we'd like to achieve with this. So moving on from that, I began developing kind of some other shapes as well, and then from there trying to figure out what the overall silhouette was that was working well, and maybe introducing some of these different size kind of cushiony pieces, which I don't think necessarily works entirely well, but it's worth exploring. And now is when we get this kind of mega structure here. And this is, again, using the base system, but we're just kind of iterating upon that. I keep copying that down to be able to retrace my steps and have a nice lineage of where I started and where I'm going. And with these, it is as simple as basically our extrusion steps here. So if we reduce these down a couple, you can see this is kind of our base form. Again, using these spherical fields, we can scale these up and down to get different shapes. Just playing around with the MoExtrude to get some various forms here. And this, again, just generating our height. So it's the same system, just playing around with the extrusion steps. So we get a multi-layered, because we're extruding up from this plane, we get a multi-layered extrusion. And then from there, the second step of it, actually, if I go back here, we can illustrate this a little bit clearer. You see this base form that we have extruding up twice, and there we are there. And then from there, extruding outwards from those polygons as well. And if we up the step count, we get some pretty cool looking, like interlocking forms could work nicely with this. So that was kind of the base system that I began exploring. And this really depends, on what approach you're trying to use, what techniques, and obviously your own kind of design sensibilities throughout that. But it is a really important learning process, especially in terms of my own personal process of going through this, whether or not it's fruitful or whether or not this gets moved down into the final concept. It really helps inform things as you move throughout. And I really see this as an exploratory process of gaining an understanding of what our base fundamental forms are that we can then compound upon and iterate upon to arrive at a final look. So this is just as much, internal as it is external. It's for, your own understanding of the project and the direction that it's going in. So I began just kind of playing around with a lot of different uses of this technique to come up with different forms, essentially using the same approach, just extruding in various ways to arrive at our form. One thing that's important to note here is just kind of how you can control these shapes in terms of you're ultimately going to get a very subdivision surface look with this technique. And so you can kind of offset that as much as possible by kind of adding in some additional layering of geometry. So you see if I add a bevel here, maybe we'll change this to proportional. We can control that edge there and how much it is rounded off. So maybe we get a harder form here that is maybe a little bit more indicative of what we're going towards, and really trying to craft this to be ownable and craft this to be your own, and really staying open to the process. This one was kind of, I was trying to get a sense of different forms in terms of having, more cubic shapes, more triangular shapes, maybe more circular shapes, and see which ones would be fruitful. This one is actually super straightforward. Again, just extruding from a cube, and it's just basically iterating upon the previous setup in a more triangular way. Getting a little bit deeper into this, layering additional Mow extrudes to try to get some more unique shapes. Again, this technique, you're going to get a very subdivision surface look. So trying to offset that as much as possible. It's always a good idea to do as many different explorations as you can, and really take the time to explore as much as possible. So then down the line, you can begin weeding things out, and you have a lot to work with, a lot that you can leave on the cutting room floor. Here, beginning to get some more interesting shapes, starting from a plane, extruding out from there, and actually added this little sphere dot right there in the center just to seal that point off, and getting this nice kind of flower structure. But again, this is a bit too rounded for my taste. I wanted something that felt more manufactured, so adding in another Mow extrude with a very small amount of centimeters there to just kind of get a harder edge on this as well. Going back to the cubic form, but then starting to begin to layer up these shapes. So we have this base form. We can take a look quickly at how I'm extruding this, doing one extrusion, second one to get this nice inner circular form and this outer edge. And this really feels like a base block. And so I was exploring throwing this in a cloner, just set to grid array, and cloning that in a cross pattern there. And I think this starting to get fruitful in the sense of how these base blocks can then build up on each other. Getting some more interesting shapes. I don't know if this one particularly is in the right vein, but it's a worthy exploration. With a lot of these things, again, it's tough to get a sense of until you just really spend the time playing around and exploring. This was a nice example of, I was using essentially the same setup from this one, but then got this nice inner divot that really feels more kind of supportive cushion in the vein that we're looking for. Here are some additional explorations of some kind of more blobular forms. What I do like here is how these feel like they're interlocking with each other and really nesting upon one another. And this kind of helped influence down the line as well with this one of trying to get a really nice sense that these things belong together and are kind of manufactured to be pieces in the same whole. This circular form isn't entirely working. It's just a little too loose and doesn't really give a sense of a nice manufactured quality, but worthy nonetheless. And all these forms are kind of the initial dive into our look development for specifically the cushions. And you can build upon these however you'd like. You can kind of take these and take which ones are working and kind of do an evolutionary process of pulling these out and doing sub executions of these. And that is really where your own personal process comes in, and your own personal taste of kind of weeding these out, especially with procedural forms like this. It is kind of oftentimes the case of generating a lot of different seeds, seeing the output, and sifting through those to find the more fruitful ones, and then you can use those as the input for your next set and kind of begin doing that process over and over. And a lot of times, the more you do that, the more refined it'll become. So for example, I feel like this one's working pretty well, so maybe I drag this one out. We can name this 1B so we know the lineage that it came from here. And if I remove this Mow extrude, we just get this nice inner form, which is coming from, we have this initial cube that we are subdividing. We're Mow extruding from that to get this nice rounded form here. And I'm adding a bevel on the edges to derive at this form. And I can kind of maybe dial this in a little bit to get a nice shape of kind of this inner circle with this housing around the outside. I'll add back in this Mow Extrude, some cool kind of flower structure here, but I'm going to reduce the extrude amount down. This is kind of nice, but I think I want to shrink the polygons as they move outward. So we'll dial that down to 0.2 perhaps, and then pump that back up a little bit. Maybe we'll add another bevel here. Whoa, that gets really crazy. We can try changing this to points, and it gets a little bit too faceted for my taste. We can turn it back to edges just to, again, get a little bit of a harder edge on there if we'd like, just to add a bit more of manufactured quality. And this is getting pretty interesting. And it's really this kind of push and pull of playing around with different parameters and seeing if you can arrive at somewhere that feels in the vein that that you'd like. So that's a quick look at developing our system for our cushions. And again, this is, I wanted to stay kind of top line with this to give a sense of how to approach this, how to iterate upon things, and begin the process for developing our style frames. And taking this time early on to not just dive straight into the final forms or a specific shot, and really lay the groundwork and derive a framework that can be utilized throughout will really set you up for success. So up next, let's take a look at kind of doing the same thing for the threading or the stitching, and then we'll begin concepting our shot and dive into layering specific systems for that. Okay, so moving forward in the process, we want to start developing our design language specifically for the stitching and the threading, and taking some time to really explore that part of the overall system so we can gain a better understanding of some different techniques and some looks that can work when we incorporate it in our larger piece. So let's fire up our render here again. And this is the same approach that we used in the cushioning in terms of trying to iterate and build upon base setup. So I began with just a kind of fundamental shape and began layering up from there. And we can briefly kind of talk through how this was approached, but again, we'll provide this scene file in case you want to dig in further. I think it's more important to kind of talk through my philosophies when approaching this stuff, and also just the process that I take personally when trying to build out a specific system and design language that can be implemented later in our work. So here, just for example, we are taking a plane. I have a couple segments here and piping that pretty straightforwardly through an atom array. And starting simple and kind of layering things on as we move along. Add some slight displacement just to give some more interesting shape to the plane. And from there, we're utilizing point bevel kind of similarly as we've done in the past. And from there, just layering some of these on. So adding another one to bevel in from the edges, and these subdivisions are allowing us to add some additional thread amounts. And the nice thing about this is, again, it's fully procedural, so we can kind of play around and dial this shape in as we'd like. Using pretty much the same material and the same lighting as before to keep it consistent. And that is kind of the first step that I took when trying to explore how we can approach our stitching. From there, started to increase in complexity. So it's essentially the same setup as we used before, just kind of tweaking some of these numbers to be able to allow for greater depth. And you see now that we're increasing this amount, we get some nice, zoom in here, whoops, one. get some really nice, let me actually dial this back one. Nice like overall pattern while also having some intricacy to the inner structures, which definitely helps a lot with the overall look in terms of having a cohesive system that can kind of hold up at a more macro scale while also utilizing these larger forms and having a nice silhouette that can be read quickly. So again, basically the same setup as we used before, just starting to layer on some additional bevels and tweak a lot of these numbers to see what feels good. And you can play around with this as you wish to kind of get whatever look you're specifically going for. From there, took some time to explore further in terms of, if we pull these off here, perhaps, going beveling from our points here and making this a little bit wider just to give us some more room to work with. Because with our bevels here, they're going to offset from those points. So the wider that we start with this, the more room we have to kind of grow incrementally as we move forward. And this one's working really nice because you get these pretty cool teardrop shapes while also getting these rounded rectangular forms, and everything feels like it's interwoven or stitched together. And it's a super lightweight setup that's good for just initial look dev. And with a lot of these things, it's about working fast and getting your idea across as quick as possible. And as things kind of ramp forward and maybe they move into production, perhaps you have to offload this from Cinema and use a program more specifically inclined towards some procedural setups. Or if just selling through style frames, you can definitely have a quicker approach to your work, utilizing some of these really lightweight techniques for look development. So from here, having this base shape kind of building up from this initial one, you can kind of see our lineage of where we are started at and where we have arrived. From there, starting to layer it up even further, so just increasing our density, but it's essentially the same setup here. Just seeing how, again, it's more of a kind of personal process as well to get a better understanding of how these things will hold up, the different kind of densities, if, perhaps as you move forward, you can kind of get a better understanding of where this technique kind of reaches its limit and isn't necessarily applicable or doesn't hold up incredibly well. And then you can start exploring some different techniques. As I was kind of exploring this, it was working nicely, especially for integrating into our larger system. So I kept down this path specifically, but this is a point where perhaps you branch off to a couple different techniques and not necessarily put all your eggs in one basket, and really diversify as much as possible as you move forward. Here is where it kind of started to get a little bit more interesting, combining a bunch of these different patterns. So having this base mesh, which again is pretty much the same system. I think when developing a design language, it's important to try to iterate upon it, but not break the fundamentals. So you want to keep moving forward down the same avenue and kind of branching out as you go, but not moving entirely into a different path, unless that is going to be another technique that perhaps becomes a different system. But if we're trying to develop our design language, this is getting a sense of maybe perhaps our letters, and then from there you can build words, and then hopefully build sentences. So making sure that everything kind of fits within our language, and if things diverge too much, making sure to prune those out or dial things back to make it feel as cohesive as possible. Again, having this kind of base mesh here, which is feeling nice. Using essentially the same technique, displacing it slightly. Here I am beveling the edge and just adding a lot of subdivisions to get a nice woven pattern here. And then adding a secondary bevel on the edges as well, just to increase the density. And this is where we get this really nice outer rounded edge with this inner grid. And this is really a kind of trial and error process. You got to take the time to play around, have fun, and see what works. So taking that base form and starting to layer on perhaps some larger beads. With this, I was thinking it'd be nice to break up the woven structure with some bigger kind of gridded beads that feel like they're set inside the system. So started to take essentially the same pattern that we were using in 3 and 4 and setting that back on top of the surface, which again, trying to keep these things consistent. So this bead pattern here on top is using essentially the same bevel distance, so we get these nicely interlocked inside, and it all feels like it's living together in a nice way. Let me pull this back here a little bit so we can take a look. And yeah, I think that this is feeling like perhaps a bit too coarse for specifically what we're looking for, but this is a kind of fruitful exploration and is why we take the time to invest in this part of the process. So from there, started to expand that out even further. So taking essentially this three different patterns that we're layering on top and throwing that into a cloner to get a larger base grid. So you can kind of see how we're building up here. Started with a very straightforward form and figured out that was working, and just continued to build upon what was working and what wasn't. Obviously, I kind of culled these for some of the explorations that weren't as successful, and that is definitely part of your own process that you'll have to take throughout of kind of weeding things out and using your eye and your design sense to make a judgment on what you feel is ultimately working and what isn't. So here, starting with this initial form, this one started working pretty well. So we used that essentially the same structure and added some more complexity. From there, taking that pattern form and starting to layer on multiples just to get a more unique and more interesting look, and starting to get this a more nicely interwoven stitching. And then now that we have that structure, perhaps this is, for example, the kind of building the words into sentences. Now we can start building a larger sectional grid with this, and getting, once this resolves a little bit, we can start to take a look. Getting some nice relation between the two grids in terms of these two kind of wing-shaped panels that butt up against each other. And again, keeping in mind the overall silhouette. So what I really like about these forms is the kind of negative space in here as well. So we get this really pretty flower shape in the center, and some of these beads kind of breaking that up as well. And the relation of these forms together really feel like one cohesive piece, because we're utilizing essentially the same grid system throughout all the interlocking pieces, which is an easy way to make everything kind of fit like that, or feel like they fit together in an interesting way. From there, I just started to build out some other explorations. So with this one, started to take some of the base. If I remove this one here, you can have a look. Some of these stripped patterns, which was feeling pretty well, and then instancing that and rotating it 45 degrees to get some nice overlaying bands here. Don't think that this is necessarily the most successful, but again, it's kind of part of the process of exploration. And then from there, exploring some circular forms that can layer on top of each other as well. This was kind of the point as I was exploring, that was thinking more about it'd be nice if a lot of these forms felt like they were laid on top of each other. it didn't end up being as successful as I was hoping it would be. And so I essentially kind of ended this design language at this point. Felt like a logical conclusion for our look here. So let's take a look at some of the style frames using this design language that I took some time to develop. And again, trying to be in a nimble and agile when doing this type of work to really be able to put as much into a lot of different baskets as possible, explore a lot of different routes, just so then you have a decent amount of ammunition in terms of weaning things out and developing and iterating upon the designs. So let's take a look quickly at some of the style frames that I explored using this design language, which included, layering on some of these foam cushions. And this kind of developed from having an idea of perhaps there's this base grid that gives you an understanding of where the other forms are deriving from, and then driving the structure of the overlaying forms with a noise pattern. And again, using some of the techniques from the foam cushion design language and seeing how we can get some nice interlocking forms here. This is essentially the same setup that we iterated upon to begin with, and you can see how these kind of break up outside and give us a nice overall structure. Starting to take some of those base forms and build them out into larger structures, larger grid systems, just to get a sense of how they can begin to live together. Some of these forms as well. I think these were starting to work pretty well in terms of perhaps some underlying cushioning. And again, starting to combine some of the threading with the cushions and trying to get a sense of how these can live together. Now that we've taken time to develop our cushion design language and our stitching design language, it's now trying to get an understanding of how they can live together, how perhaps they can utilize the same underlying grid to live together. We've kind of worked through these. And these, again, are getting a little too coarse and feel like kind of a woven wicker or like mesh rather than fine fabric, but some interesting explorations there. So now is a point in the process where perhaps start to do some motion tests and concept on a shot. Going back to the initial brief here, I started to have the idea of perhaps showing the underlying comfort and the support of the product by having it house a very fragile object within the center. So having this center form that is perhaps made up of glass or a thin bubble that can easily be popped, but the grid system of the cushions is actually being responsive. So now that we have our underlying design system, did some early explorations of our cushions and our threading, perhaps this is the point where we begin doing some motion tests or some early concept shots on how we want to represent the product and what we feel is the most effective way of distilling down the benefits and the concepts that the client is looking to convey. And looking back through these, as well as some of my early sketches, I started to get the idea of perhaps trying to show the comfort and the support of the product by having this fragile inner object that perhaps is made of, bubble material or a glass that can be easily broken, easily popped, but is being enveloped by the product and is actually, responding to the movement in a way that really is hitting some of the points that the client is looking for. It's intriguing. It has perhaps some kind of mesmerizing motion that you'd want to watch continually. Perhaps we can even make it, a continual loop. And it really shows, it contrasts the inner center sphere that is this very fragile object, contrast that with the cushions themselves that are being responsive and dynamic to the movement and really supporting it throughout. I think could be a nice initial concept shot that we can move forward with. So let's start developing that now. We can dive into motion test and take a look at how we can start using some of our systems, some of our approaches, take our intro look development and explorations and move forward with that and start to concept our first shot. All right, so jumping back into Cinema, I'm going to actually close down my render views here to give us some more screen real estate for the moment. And we can start building upon everything we've learned thus far. So we know we want our cushion, so let's throw down just a simple plane. I'm going to scale this up here and set it to 1200 by 1200. And for our segments, we're going to use kind of the same technique we used before with beveling to get more interesting shape. So I'm going to lower our segments here a little bit. And let's, again, going to hit Shift-C to bring up our quick command window, and we'll grab ourselves a bevel. I'm just going to turn on shading lines so we can see specifically what we're doing here. And for this, I think we're going to stick to edge mode, and we're just going to play with our offset here. I want to get a nice, I think that's actually pretty good right here, 12. I want to get a nice distribution in terms of having these inner squares that are pretty uniform, these outer squares, and then these like alleyways in between. So I want, I think 12 is actually pretty good. And this will be our kind of base pattern that we are working with here. So from there, we want to start making our housing for the inner fragile object. So let's grab a displacer here, and we'll throw this underneath the plane. We're eventually going to want to break out our hierarchy here, again, using kind of a smart parent-child relationship as we move forward. But for now, we can just kind of keep it the way that we are. So first, let's just throw a color. We'll just throw white in here, so it just applies it uniformly across the board. There's that there. Let me jump out of my camera. And let's go back to our displacer. And for this, we'll have to tweak this as we go along, but we can set this to perhaps 60, 65. If I remember correctly, I think that's probably what we want. For our type, we're actually going to tweak these a little bit. So we can keep intensity centered, fine. Direction, we don't want it along the vertex. We actually want it planar because we only want it to move upwards along the Y. So we'll change that to Y here. And just for viewing purposes, actually let's grab our sphere here and use this as our input. So we'll eventually make these dynamic so they can respond to one another. But for now, we can just use it as an input. So I'm going to go to my displacer, under fall off. We can drag in our sphere. I'm going to change this to surface here. And as we crank this up, you can see we're starting to get the distance we're looking for. This is actually the inverse of what we want. So let me drag this over so you can see a little bit clearer. We can invert this so it's actually syncing inside of our mesh here, which is working pretty well. And now as we move this around, it's going to kind of house nicely within there. And again, I was thinking initially when started to envision the shot, I wanted this to loop so we can kind of have this stay on a uniform movement as it kind of travels around. Easy way to do that is let's grab a null. This will be at our center here. I'm going to throw it within my sphere, hit reset our position, scale, and our rotation there. So it's back in our sphere. We pull that back out. And now it's centered with our sphere here. And we can make our sphere a child of that and just offset it by however amount we like. I think that's good for now. And then now this null can be our driver to kind of have this travel around. And for this, we can just use signal, easy enough. We'll grab our null, we'll grab our rotation value there that we want to tweak. I'm just going to set this for now to constant values. We'll just change it to linear. Currently my timeline's at 300, so let's set it to that. And let's do 360. I think we want this in the positive, but we can see, actually I want it to move the opposite direction here. So we can go negative 360 and our sphere will travel around here. And there we go. We can start to introduce some positive and negative y values, so it kind of moves up and down and gives a more unique movement. But for now, this works pretty well. And then from here, we are going to start adding in our Mow extrudes to actually get our cushioning. So let's go ahead and grab a Mow extrude. And I'm going to make it a child of our plane. Actually, now that we're here, let's start setting up our smarter parent-child relationship. So we'll just call this perhaps driver. It's going to drive our animation. And for the plane, let's actually, so we can keep the displacer within the plane, but we want to break these out because I eventually want to be able to reference, because we're going to be instancing this geo, we want to be able to instance different levels. So for example, if I throw both of these in a null here, it'll still affect, because these are essentially in the same place in the hierarchy, the bevel will still affect the plane, but now this is broken out, so I can instance this plane and just grab the plane in the displacer, or I can instance this, and perhaps we can call this plane and bevel. And now we can instance specifically the plane and the bevel if we'd like as well. And then we can do another one and group these together. And now you'll see it's actually being affected again because now these are in the same place in the hierarchy. And we can call this one plane. Sorry, a little hard to type here with positioning for the recording. And Mow extrude. Cool. So now we can reference this if we like, or anywhere down the chain. It just gives us much more flexibility in down the line in terms of what we want to instance specifically. So here we go. Let's jump back into our Mow extrude here. And for the Mow extrude, I'm going to tweak this transform value. First off, this defaults towards 4 extrusion steps. I only want 1 is what I'm looking for here. And redo that. And we can go into the transform values and tweak this a little bit. So I want to pump this up. Perhaps this will be, I think 30 is working pretty well. And we can actually keep these the same, I believe, for now. And we can see as we move forward. So just to give a look at what this actually will look like with our subdivisions, let me fire up Octane again, and I'll dock this over here, and we can hit render. And right now, it's, we're not actually subdividing, so it's essentially the same look. But what we can do is throw an Octane tag on our plane and increase the subdivisions perhaps to 2. And now we can get a look at our cushioning. But right now this is way too blobular, very subdivision look, and we want to give it more definition. So we can either add a bevel just to give another edge, just to harden it up a little bit, or we could grab another Mow extrude if we want, and perhaps with this one, we lower down the extrusion step, so it's just essentially shrinking slightly down on the edge. It's giving us pretty close to the same effect we get with a bevel, but kind of playing around, this is looking pretty good for what we want. So there we are. And now if we start to press play, see we got, so this kind of updates as we move along. You can see, let me actually pause this just a little quicker. See we get our kind of base function form. Now, we can, so we have this, we want to break out this mo_extrude again because down the line we're going to want to be smart about how we reference these. Let's break that out, and we can do plain maybe and two mo_extrudes, just so we know what we're working with here. All right, so I'm actually going to close this Octane window again and free up our screen space here. And what I want to do next in terms of our system is I want to create a upper layer cloth that can actually be revealing this underlying cushioning and threading. So if we think of this actually as our overall product, we can have the surrounding cloth that wraps around this cushioning on top. And then as the sphere travels around, it'll actually cut away and reveal the inner workings of the threading and the cushions beneath. So let's start building out that aspect of our system now. What we can do is, since we have this nice hierarchy all set up, we can just grab just the instance of our plane with the beveling without the mo_extrude. So if I just select that and grab an instance, we can grab an instance of just the plane and the bevel, which is exactly what we need. So if we move this up here, you can see we have just that there. And what we want to do is start to remove this center area. And how we can do that is actually just fracture these individual polygons apart and scale them down and remove them so they can give way to the inner workings underneath. So let's go ahead and grab a fracture here, and we'll throw our plane and bevel instance underneath our fracture. Let me just collapse these. And what we want to do now is set this fracture mode actually to, rather than straight, we're going to set it to explode segments. So we can remove all of our segments here. And so now we can just grab a simple plane effector. We're going to go into our parameters here. We'll turn off the position. We'll turn on scale, and we'll scale this down. But you see right now, it's actually affecting, even though we have this set to explode segments, it's not actually able to explode all these segments because this is procedurally generated objects. It's still parametric. It's not actually able to fracture apart these polygons. So a good technique to kind of circumnavigate this is what we can do is actually just move this down. We do want to set this to -1 eventually, just to get rid of the inner polygons. We keep to this for now just so we can see what we're doing here. And we can utilize a polyFX. So if we grab polyFX, this will essentially just break apart the polygons in a way that we need. So we can make that a child of our plane and bevel instance. And while selecting this polyFX, we can grab another plane effector here. And you can see instantly it's actually doing what we need it to do. It's breaking apart all the individual polygons. I'm going to turn off position. And for scale, I actually don't want this, personally to scale down the polygons. I'm going to do that with the fracture. I just need this to just break up all the individual polygons how I need them. So what we can do is we can just scale them up a little bit, actually. And if I remove this fracture plane effector that's affecting the scale, we can see what we're doing here. And let's actually name these while we're at it. So this one we'll name polyFX just to keep this nice and clear. And this one we will name fracture. So now that we have those, we can start to break this apart in a way that we need. So I'll just set this maybe to 0.05 just to scale it up a little bit. And then if we enable our fracture again, you'll see that we're able to now individually affect each polygon, which is perfect. So if I set this to -1, it's going to get rid of them all. And for our fall off, we can use our trusty driver again. So let's drag our driver into our fall off. We'll go to layer, set this to surface again, and we can tweak this radius. And you can see it's referencing the driver, so we can have all the different aspects of our system as we keep layering them on, all referencing the same piece of geo in the center as it travels along, and it's just responsive to that. I do want this outer edge to have a bit of a stronger offset here, so we can tweak this, and then I'll actually shrink this back down. So perhaps that's kind of our distance here. We can change these as we move along. That's a good thing about building out this system in this way, that it's really responsive to changes and feedback down the line. So we'll go back into our remapping. I want to change the color to black because we're actually going to use this as well. So for example, if I change this remapping amount to just a hard edge, which is essentially what we want, because we want it to just remove that edge there, you'll see that we get this popping in and out of the polygons because there's no fall off, so it's just all or nothing there. And if you would say, well, we can tweak this amount and we can just make this a little bit softer, and then it's not as drastic as it moves along. But I actually don't want these to scale down as they travel along, because it's going to draw your eye away from this center sphere. I think when doing different tests and really taking into consideration your composition and the overall motion, it's important to be cognizant of where you're kind of leading the viewer's eye throughout. So having these outer upper layer cloth polygons scaling down is really going to just end up drawing your eye away from what we want to lead the eye towards is the center there. So I don't want to have these kind of scale down because it's going to get very busy, and it's going to just end up distracting the viewer from where I want them to focus. So we do want to have that hard edge, but one thing that's going to be a problem with that is as we press play with the sphere, you'll see that we get this popping that just, again, is going to draw your eye away. It's going to be very distracting for the viewer. And so we need a kind of softer edge there. And what we can do is just use the color to drive our opacity in our shader. So this just slowly and nicely kind of disappears along the edge, and you get a really nice overlay of cloth, and like there's this kind of X-ray seen through, revealing what's underneath, and it's not distracting you from all the action. So we'll keep this one as a hard edge there, and this will actually just be, we'll rename this fracture delete center, perhaps. So this is just going to be to delete our center. We'll select our fracture again, and we want to add another plane effector to drive our color. So let's turn off the position there, and we want to drag back in our sphere here. So we're going to drag in our sphere. Change this again. We'll change the surface, and we'll drag this up. And now you see we're using this one to drive the color, which is working. We need to change the color remap to black again, and we'll change the remapping. I want like maybe 1 or 2 or 3 rows of polygons to be affected, just so you have nicely dialed in edge there in terms of the opacity change. So we can kind of tweak this to get where we need. Once this is completely black, it won't be visible. And I think that's pretty good. Again, we can kind of tweak this as we move along, but this will be our color driver. Let's drag this plane effector down, and let's group all this. I'm hitting Alt-G to create a group, and we'll call it upper cloth. And there we go. We got our upper cloth. We're driving the color. And just to demonstrate this, let's just grab a Octane material. We'll throw this on our fracture here. Let's boot up our live viewer. Hit render. And we just need to pump this into our opacity. So right at the very bottom here is MoGraph color shader node. So we'll grab that and just scale this back down. We got very limited real estate with this recording. And we just want to, easy enough, put that into our opacity. And now you see we get this pretty nice fall off. So as this sphere travels around, it has a radius around it in which it reveals the underlying cushion, which is cool. And let's perhaps dial this in. So I also want to rename this. We'll call it Fracture Color Driver. Oh, spelled color wrong. There we go. And let's tweak this a little bit. We can close down our node editor. Don't need that. And we'll dial this back a little bit. And we also need to dial back our fracture center, or delete center rather. So that's looking pretty good. Perhaps I tweak this remap just so we get a little bit more of a fall off. And now, yeah, we start to reveal underneath. One thing I do want to add is some definition to this plane. So we can actually just essentially, because we're referencing the same beveled plane here, we can add some Moe extrudes to this. So let's go ahead and grab trusty Moe extrude, and we can throw this in here. Actually want to, so let's again remove. Just gonna have to pause our render real quick just to be safe. And turn this off. And what we can do here is just get a little bit of definition. So maybe I just set this to 3, and we should get, let me fire this back up, we should get just a nice overlay cloth there that can reveal itself as the sphere moves along. And again, this is nice kind of starting to build out our base layering of our different systems, and we can kind of tweak these as they respond to each other and as we move along and kind of iterate upon the shot and dial these things in even further. So the next thing I want to quickly go over is getting our sphere and our underlying cushioning dynamic with each other. So let me pause this render, undock it, and we'll remove that there. And what we want to do is let's actually disable all of these because we don't need to worry about that for now. It's a nice thing about having these all broken out separately is we can just kind of work specifically with what we need to look at the time, not have to worry about anything else. You can build, a simple Espresso setup for UI at the top to kind of enable and disable these as you need them, but for now this will kind of do what we need it to. And I'm going to quickly go over just some things to be mindful of when building out the dynamic setup for creating our inner sphere. But in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of do the cooking show technique of we're going to jump ahead to something that is pre-baked just to take a look at how it can come together, because with this types of dynamics, it's very a lot of trial and error and really taking the time to tweak the different parameters to get it to respond exactly how you need it. So just to kind of save us in that regard, we'll jump forward a little bit, but just kind of base techniques here to cover. We want to get our plane kind of reactive with our plane reactive with our inner object here. So what we can do is we'll jump into the plane, and we'll add in a collider object. And essentially, all we need to really tweak here at the moment is to get this to be responsive to the fact that this is a dynamically changing mesh. So we want to change this shape from automatic to moving mesh. And that is essentially all we need in that regard for now. For our driver, we're going to want to make this a soft body. So if I enable soft body, one thing we want to quickly do is, right now we don't have a uniform mesh in terms of our polygons. So we want to change this to icosahedron, and we can perhaps even drop down these segments for now. We can always subdivide moving forward and get a nice rounded mesh that way, but just to kind of lower our calculation times, that'll help a lot. One other thing that will be very beneficial in that regard is this here with self-collisions. Right now with self-collisions checked on, it's going to actually try to calculate for each polygon whether or not they're colliding with each other. And we don't actually need it to waste that time calculating. It's not going to be a factor here. So if we turn off self-collisions, it won't actually take the time to calculate the collisions of itself for each individual polygon. It'll just focus on the other objects there. So we'll turn that off. And one thing we initially know we need to do is this sphere needs to come down and kind of rest in here initially, right? Like it needs to start up here and kind of push down in so that it can get nice and comfy inside of our cushioning here. So what we can do is just add another signal tag and start to animate our Y value here. So we can drag in our Y, change this curve here. And for our start position, we just raise it up. And for the time, I'm actually just going to do half a second. So we'll do 12 frames, working at 24 frames a second for this. And now it'll come down and kind of rest inside the cushions. You'll see it's just bouncing off right now because it's no longer responsive to our animation parameters. It's just purely dynamic. And what we want to do is get it to still be responsive to how we're animating it. So we can do that with under force here, follow position. We can start to introduce some of this. And how high this value is how much it's going to blend between our dynamic state and how much it's going to follow the position of our animation. I know we definitely want to start building out some other aspects of the system, and with that, it's often the case of just disabling the dynamics for now, just so we can see how this is working overall and be able to tweak this without having to worry about the calculation times. And then as all the different aspects of the system are set up, we can go back and kind of tweak the dynamics as we need. So it really is kind of being selective and tactical about which aspects of the system really need the most focus at the time, and reintroducing those as you go. So let's jump into the kind of pre-baked scene here and take a look. Essentially the same setup as I kind of did some additional explorations. I began to realize that I wanted to have these center cushions actually kind of push up to greet and meet the center object to kind of be more welcoming, more inviting, and really feel like it's being responsive to the center object. So that was kind of the main tweak, and it also helped with the dynamics because it's actually creating this nice little center cushion, and keeping everything low poly and just doing the subdivisions on the render side really helps with calculations as well, because it's not having to calculate all the subdivided surface. Again, it's a balance, because sometimes if you need this really close for kind of higher density mesh, it's not going to be accurate, because it's not going to be able to calculate some of those rounded corners, and that'll be noticeable. But for this setup and just for this kind of motion test, to walk us through some different approaches and techniques and kind of overall process. It does the job pretty well. So I basically started to tweak the cushion system, cleaned up a lot of our hierarchy to get this working a little bit better, and started to introduce the sphere in terms of our dynamics. So you can see now it inflates a little bit. I'm using a cloth surface just to subdivide this down and add a little bit of thickness. So once we actually start to play with our materials, I was going to make this a nice kind of bubble material that needed a thickness to it to get the look that I was going for. Again, had the kind of animation, so the sphere inflates and sinks down into that cushioning there. And we have the color driver on the outside to drive the opacity and that cutaway of the outer cloth underneath. And this is a nice kind of base setup. And from here, we can begin to layer on some additional systems. So it'll be, adding in the threading. And also I knew that I wanted to add some additional detail to the cushioning and having, if we remember back to our mood board and our different reference boards, that layering of materials. And I wanted to have some inner padding that layers on to the cushions and can actually be derived, again, from the same setup, and just kind of reform these polygons, shrink them down so we can get layered padding, add in some additional threading, and take a look at working on our materials and getting this motion test moving along here. So that'll be it for this lesson. I look forward to the next lesson, and thanks so much for joining. Take care. Hello, and welcome back to Procedural Systems for Production in Cinema 4D. In this final lesson, we'll be covering finessing and finishing our shot, and we'll continue our development of our motion test by building out some additional subsystems that we'll need for padding layers and the stitching patterns to overlay on top. We'll briefly cover approach to look development and texturing and lighting, and then cover finalizing the shot with some micro details and some nice final touches to really bring it across the finish line. And then we'll close with some final thoughts and philosophies on the project as a whole and how to kind of move forward from our initial shot and maybe revisiting some style frames to develop further and really round out our project as a whole. So let's dive in to our motion test, see where it's at, and continue our development there. All right, and here we are where we left off from the last lesson. We have our base system set up here, and we can start layering on some additional subsystems. And usually my approach with developing shots like this is, trying to get the bones worked out and then kind of fleshing it out from there. So making sure that, our initial setup is working the way that we like it, and then now kind of getting more into the minutia of developing this and pushing it towards a direction that we're happy with. So currently we have our center fragile sphere that's being cradled by the cushioning as it travels along, and that center sphere traveling is actually driving the X-ray kind of cutaway to reveal the inner cushioning and the inner workings. And now that we have this cutaway, I want to start adding some layering onto the center so it really feels like the center sphere is being supported and cushioned as much as possible, and really can drive home some of